In the days when judges ruled over Israel, in the town of Bethlehem, there lived a man whose fields stretched beyond what the eye could measure in a morning's walk. Boaz owned land that had been worked by his fathers and their fathers before them, and each season brought forth grain that filled the storehouses without fail. His wealth did not announce itself through gold or silver displayed in the marketplace, but through the steady rhythm of harvest and the sound of grain falling into baskets that never seemed to empty. The workers who labored in his fields knew him not as a master who demanded speed, but as one who observed the patterns of the seasons and moved according to what the land could bear. When other landowners pressed their servants to gather quickly and sell while prices rose, Boaz allowed his workers to glean thoroughly, to rest when the sun grew fierce, and to gather grain with the same careful attention their grandfathers had shown. His storehouses filled more slowly than those of his neighbors, but they filled completely, and the grain within them was clean and whole. The elders who sat at the city gates spoke of Boaz with a recognition that went deeper than the counting of his possessions. They had watched him through seasons of plenty and seasons of want, and in both he had conducted his affairs with the same measured attention to what was just and what would endure. When disputes arose concerning land boundaries or the treatment of workers, they called upon him not because he possessed the most silver, but because his word had proven reliable across years that had tested many men's integrity. His reputation spread through Bethlehem not through proclamation, but through the quiet testimony of those who had dealt with him. Merchants knew that grain purchased from Boaz would be exactly as described, measured fairly, and delivered when promised. Workers from surrounding towns sought employment in his fields because they understood that their wages would be paid in full, and their families would not suffer want while they labored. The poor who came to glean in his fields found that he had instructed his reapers to leave portions that would feed families through the winter months. Yet for all his abundance, there was a limitation that shaped the manner of his increase. While other men of wealth expanded rapidly, purchasing additional lands, acquiring new enterprises, and multiplying their holdings through swift action and calculated risk, Boaz moved with deliberate restraint. When opportunities arose to buy the fields of men pressed by debt, he considered not only the profit such purchases might bring, but how such acquisitions would affect the families who had worked those lands for generations. This restraint was not born of fear or uncertainty about his ability to manage greater holdings. His knowledge of agriculture was deep, his understanding of trade routes and seasonal markets was complete, and his resources were sufficient to pursue expansion with confidence. Rather, his caution arose from a recognition that wealth accumulated too quickly often carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. He had observed how men who gathered riches hastily found themselves isolated from the very communities that had made their prosperity possible. The consequence of this measured approach was visible to all who watched. While his neighbors celebrated harvests that filled their barns to overflowing in single seasons, Boaz's increase came in steady increments that built upon what had come before. His wealth grew as a tree grows, with deep roots that drew nourishment from sources that did not fail even in difficult years. The expansion of his holdings followed patterns that preserved the relationships upon which his continued success depended. Other landowners sometimes wondered at his methods. They saw opportunities he declined, profits he willingly forfeited, and advantages he chose not to press when circumstances might have favored aggressive action. When famines struck neighboring regions and desperate men offered to sell their inheritances for portions of grain, Boaz would often provide the needed food without demanding the permanent transfer of land that other wealthy men saw as natural payment for such assistance. The workers in his fields understood that their employment was secure not merely for a season or a year, but for as long as they performed their duties with diligence. This knowledge affected the quality of their work in ways that could be measured in the perfect condition of his tools, the careful maintenance of his buildings, and the thorough completion of every task from the smallest to the greatest. They tended his possessions as if they were their own, because they had learned that his prosperity was connected to their welfare in ways that went beyond the payment of daily wages. The merchants who traded with Boaz discovered that agreements made with him required no complex contracts or elaborate securities. His word, given simply and without ceremony, proved more reliable than written documents sealed with the marks of lesser men. This reputation preceded him into every transaction, allowing him to negotiate from a position of trust that other wealthy men could not achieve, despite their greater resources. The time he had invested in building this standing returned to him in the form of opportunities that were offered to few. In the councils where men of influence gathered to discuss matters affecting the town and the surrounding region, Boaz's voice carried weight that was not proportional merely to his wealth. His opinions were sought not because he could buy influence, but because his judgment had proven sound in circumstances that had confounded others. When decisions were made that would affect the welfare of many families, his counsel was valued because all knew that his recommendations would consider the long-term consequences rather than immediate advantages. As seasons passed and his reputation spread beyond Bethlehem to other cities in Judah, Boaz found that opportunities came to him without his seeking them. Men of substance from distant places sought him out as a partner in ventures they might have pursued alone if they had possessed his standing in the community. The trust he had built locally became a form of wealth that could be neither stolen by thieves nor destroyed by natural calamity. The young men of Bethlehem who worked in his fields observed his methods and began to understand that true prosperity required a foundation that could not be built quickly. They watched how he treated agreements, how he responded to setbacks, and how he managed relationships with those who depended upon him for their livelihood. Some among them began to adopt similar approaches in their own smaller endeavors, discovering that the principles that governed his success could be applied regardless of the scale of one's operations. There came a time when economic pressures struck the land of Judah with particular severity. Crops failed in many regions, trade routes became uncertain, and men who had built their wealth on rapid expansion found themselves unable to maintain what they had acquired so hastily. The debts they had assumed in their eagerness to grow quickly became burdens they could not bear when their sources of income diminished. Many who had seemed prosperous only seasons before found themselves forced to sell their holdings to meet obligations they had incurred in more optimistic times. During this period of general hardship, the foundation that Boaz had built through years of measured restraint proved its worth. His wealth had not been leveraged beyond his ability to maintain it in difficult circumstances. The relationships he had cultivated provided him with information about changing conditions before they affected his operations. The trust he had earned allowed him to negotiate arrangements that less established men could not obtain. While others struggled to maintain their positions, he found himself able to expand his holdings at reasonable prices from men who were grateful to sell to someone they knew would treat their former workers and tenants with fairness. Yet even in these favorable circumstances, Boaz maintained the same deliberate pace that had characterized his earlier activities. He did not seize every opportunity that presented itself, nor did he press every advantage that his strong position might have allowed. Instead, he selected carefully, ensuring that each new acquisition could be managed properly and that each transaction served the long-term interests of all parties involved. His expansion during this period followed the same principles that had guided his earlier restraint, adapted to circumstances that now favored growth over preservation. The people of Bethlehem witnessed this demonstration of the difference between wealth that is built hastily and wealth that is established on firm foundations. They saw how men whose prosperity had seemed impressive in good times found themselves vulnerable when conditions changed, while one who had grown his holdings slowly maintained his position and even strengthened it. The lesson was not lost on those who possessed the wisdom to observe and understand what they were seeing. Through all of these experiences, Boaz himself remained unchanged in his manner of conducting affairs. Success did not make him arrogant, nor did the sight of others' failures make him harsh in his judgments. He continued to treat his workers with the same consideration, to honor his agreements with the same scrupulous attention, and to participate in the community with the same quiet dignity that had characterized him when his holdings were smaller. His character had not been shaped by his circumstances, but had instead shaped the manner in which his circumstances developed. As his influence grew, so did the number of people who sought his advice on matters both personal and commercial. Men brought their disputes to him not because he held any official position, but because they trusted his judgment and knew that his recommendations would be guided by principles rather than personal advantage. Young men asked his counsel about marriage, about the management of inherited land, and about the conduct of trade. In each case, he offered his thoughts simply and without lengthy explanation, allowing others to decide for themselves how to apply what they had heard. The reputation that had begun in the fields around Bethlehem now extended throughout the territory of Judah and beyond. Travelers brought word of opportunities in distant places, seeking his participation in enterprises that required both resources and reliability. Kings and governors, when they had need of grain or other provisions, preferred to deal with men whose word was known to be trustworthy. The network of relationships that had grown from his careful attention to every transaction now provided him access to opportunities that wealth alone could never have purchased. In the quiet hours, when the day's work was completed and the household had settled into rest, Boaz would sometimes walk through his fields and consider the path that had brought him to his present position. He had not sought to become wealthy quickly, nor had he pursued fame or influence for their own sake. Instead, he had simply conducted each day's affairs according to principles that seemed right to him, allowing the consequences to develop as they would. The prosperity that had resulted was not an end he had pursued directly, but a byproduct of decisions made for other reasons. The patterns he had established in small matters had proven reliable when applied to larger concerns. The restraint he had exercised when the temptation was to move quickly had preserved his position when speed would have led to disaster. The reputation he had built through countless individual acts of fairness and reliability had become a form of wealth more valuable than silver or gold. What had begun as simple attention to right conduct had grown into a network of relationships and opportunities that extended far beyond what he could have imagined when he first inherited his father's land. Standing in fields that now stretched to horizons he had not dreamed of owning, surrounded by storehouses filled with grain that represented the labor of hundreds of workers, Boaz understood that his true wealth lay not in these visible possessions, but in the invisible bonds of trust and respect that had made their accumulation possible. The reputation that had grown slowly through years of consistent conduct had become the foundation upon which all his other assets rested. Without it, the land and buildings and stores of grain would lose much of their value. With it, opportunities would continue to present themselves for as long as he maintained the principles that had created it. The lesson was clear to those who had eyes to see it. Wealth that is built upon reputation moves slowly, but endures through circumstances that destroy riches accumulated by other means. Trust, once earned, becomes a resource that generates opportunities and protects existing assets in ways that cannot be achieved through force or cleverness alone. The man who chooses to grow his holdings at the pace that allows his character to keep step with his possessions finds that both are strengthened by the process. These are the chronicles of wealth, not as men desire it, but as it is formed.